Hello and welcome to the Ultimate Decades Challenge recap video for the years 1300 through 1320 for the Hawthorne Legacy. Our starting Sims were Walter Hawthorne and Marjorie Hawthorne, who were newlyweds at the time. Neither of them had any close relatives, as Walter's family died in a tragic accident when he was a young man. We don't really know the details of that since he didn't like to talk about it. And Marjorie had several older siblings who married into the local families where she grew up, so her parents arranged a more distant marriage for her to Walter, which was arranged through some mutual friends. So her family is alive and well, but lives very far away and is not really practical to visit often. So they got married in 1300, barely knowing each other, and they had their first daughter, Agneta, in 1301. After that, they had some struggles with fertility and getting pregnant, and had a few big gaps between kids over the next few years. Walter used the fertile land around their house to start a farm and also got a few chickens. They did have a lot of issues with wild foxes for the first several years of the farm until they could afford to finally build a fence. So they struggled financially. On one occasion, they could not pay their taxes to the local lord and had some of their property destroyed. They also had some misunderstandings about Marjorie's friendliness that came off as flirting when she would talk to other men. And after a few incidents on a heart-to-heart, she and Walter came to an understanding that brought them closer together. Throughout the first few years of their marriage, they got to know each other and fell in love. They also befriended neighborhood families, such as the Serfs, with Archer and Ada, the Sestaris, which was John and Caitlin, and their kids, Julio, Andrea, and Bubbles. In 1304, Walter found a new financial opportunity by fishing in the nearby river. They had two sons, Henry in 1304 and Arthur in 1308, who unfortunately died as babies, less than 2 years old. So Agneta remained their only living child. In 1307, the Serf couple had triplets, Hannah, Charles, and Kelvin. Then Walter and Marjorie had Richard, their current heir, born in 1309. After Richard's birth, the fertility issues returned and wore on Walter and Marjorie's hearts. They wanted more children, but in the meantime focused on their individual work. Around this time, Marjorie started keeping bees and selling the honey, and Walter finally built that fence. In 1309, Agneta found a worn book on the streets at the age of 8 and started to teach herself to read. A few months later, she snuck into the church library, where she met the Reverend, who after an initial chastisement allowed her access to the library as long as she helped sweep up and dust the old books. Cecily was then born in 1311. A few months after Cecily's birth, Marjorie succumbed to an unrelated illness and died. At the time, they had 3 living children, Agneta, who was 10, Richard was 2, and Cecily was 3 months. Walter cared for the children by himself for several months with the help of some neighbors. However, he could not keep up with both the kids and the farm. He began searching for a new wife and was told of a widow who recently arrived in town. Her name was Eldreda, and she had a younger daughter, Emma, who was only 2 years old. Eldreda's husband had recently died, and she nor her daughter were eligible to inherit his property, so she needed to remarry to provide for their future. After a brief courtship, Walter and Eldreda entered into a marriage of convenience to ensure the future of both their families. Walter promised to treat Emma as his own daughter in all the ways he could. They got married in the year 1313. Aldrada brought organization to the home and helped care for Richard and Cecily. Agneta was more independent and helped around the farm some, but she also enjoyed her freedom on excursions to town and visiting the library. The famine took place from 1315 to 1317, during which no crops grew, and without proper seed, the Hawthornes had to sell their chickens for meat. Walter helped sustain them through fishing. Walter and Aldrada's first child together, Isabel, born in 1315, died at a few months old. Then they had Bridget, who was born in 1316. Despite not trying to have more children while the famine continued, Aldrada became pregnant again. In 1317, Walter and Emma starved as their food reserves dwindled. Walter in particular wanted his pregnant wife and their young children to eat instead of him. And while they were all malnourished at the end, Emma's body could not sustain her anymore. A few other villagers also died during this famine. As the famine was alleviating, Aldrada gave birth to triplets, which was a joyous blessing since they would be Walter's last children. However, caring for triplets at the end of the famine and without a husband was daunting. Unfortunately, one of the triplets, Joan, died a few months later. Her brothers Peter and Thomas lived. When the famine started to abate, the Hawthornes were able to replant their crops. As the crops were able to grow, they also reacquired chickens. Richard took up fishing in his father's place to help provide for the family. For the next couple of years, Aldrada was busy taking care of the young children. With help from Agneta, Richard, and Cecily, they made enough money to buy a couple of goats. When Agneta turned 18, the Reverend gave her a pile of books to sustain her love for reading, but encouraged her to find a proper husband. Agneta lingered at home for another year to help Aldrada, but in 1320 she married Preston Vick, a nearby farmer from a family they didn't know very well. Looking at the family tree, we can see that our first generation heir Walter had 2 wives, Marjorie and Aldrada, and he had 5 children with each of them. As of 1320, he had 6 children alive: Agneta, Richard, Cecily, Bridget, Peter, and Thomas. Aldrada is not planning on remarrying as she wants to focus on the health of her remaining children. And Richard is our current heir. After him, the inheritance would proceed to Peter and then Thomas, and then Preston as Agneta's husband. I also want to show you guys a bit of snippets from my spreadsheet that I have. I'm not planning on publishing the spreadsheet itself since there are many great examples on Morbid Gamers Discord of how you could set this up if you are interested in setting it up yourself. But here are the age stages that I have been following. I am using Morbid's suggestion of 4 days equaling a year, but some of the ages are a little bit different. I did adjust the rolls a little bit to be more realistic for the time, so there is higher death chance for younger children, but also if Sims do make it to adult stages, they have some chance of living into their 40s and 50s. Here's my spreadsheet of all the Sims in our main legacy. So this includes the Hawthorne family, as well as side households. So our first side household is Agneta with her husband Preston. I also included Aldrada's daughter in here, Emma. I also have a spreadsheet where I'm tracking villagers, very similar to the Sims info spreadsheet. I am tracking each family, as well as inheritance and children and marriages all in here. This helps me with finding matches for our Sims who are of an appropriate age. I just like to have some actual families in the town that we can marry. I do also download Sims from the gallery quite frequently because there's only like 4 or 5 village families I'm tracking, as you can see here. So there's not always going to be a great fit for our Sims to marry, but I would like to keep friends with these families and kind of see how they grow and develop over time. I'm not really controlling a lot of them. I do occasionally cause them to have kids or marry off. Hopefully that will help us keep the realism going. Let's take a look at the family tree one more time. The only person missing from here is Agneta's husband, Preston. They got married at the very end of 1320, so he is not on here yet. And I am missing some profile pictures, so apologies about that. But as Walter has now passed away, we'll be focusing on the kids growing up. And as Richard enters into adulthood, he will then become our main Sim. And that concludes our recap from 1300 to 1320. Let me know what you think of the series so far, and if you have any ideas of stories or personalities that you see these kids having as they grow up. And I am looking forward to continuing this series with you guys. It has been quite fun and also challenging at times, but I feel really good about where we are right now. Losing Walter was definitely a big hit to our plans, but I do think he had enough kids to sustain us through to the next couple generations. So I think we're sitting in a pretty good spot overall, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next. Thank you so much for tuning into this video, and I will see you next time.